So, welcome back to Camphor Convos. Riley, I don't know if you can recall Saturday mornings sitting in front of the television and watching Disney Channel or whatever cartoon was playing on and just being enamored by storytelling for the first time. And today we have one of the people who was fundamental in creating our childhood Saturday mornings with titles like True Confession, Smart House, and The Land Before Time, The Men Who Wrote Your Childhood, Stu Krieger. Thank you for joining.
Guys, pleasure to
Thank you
be
so
here.
much for joining us. Um, so I'll just kind of jump right into this. Here at Camphor, we really care about the community we're trying to build. And uh, I just wanted to ask, are there any collaborators or friends that you trust to go to whenever you're writing? Or do you like to do more of the process on your own? Um, and I'm kind of interested here in the process uh, that and starting point you take to write something and like how do you step away from it for a while or come back or just kind of take me through that.
Yeah. I was always a writer who liked to write alone. I had friends that were writing partners, and often when I would talk to them about the pros and cons of being in a partnership versus writing alone, they would say that for them, they needed somebody to be accountable for. They needed somebody that would say, "Come on, dude, let's go, let's get it done." And the partnership really worked for them. For me, and I don't know why, but I was always an incredibly both motivated and disciplined writer, and I just when I'm working, I don't want other input. I don't want other interference. I don't want other opinions. But I was somebody through my entire professional writing career, which was more than 30 years as a screenwriter. I was in my office every morning by 9:30. I worked till lunchtime. I would go out somewhere in the neighborhood, take lunch, come back and work from, usually about 1:30 until 5:30. And that was my job. And people would say to me, "Oh my God, you're so disciplined." And I would say to them, "Do you get up in the morning and put on a suit and drive to work?" And they would go, "Yeah." And I go, "Oh my God, you're so disciplined." And they would go, "Yeah, but no, if I worked at home, I would." And I go, "Yeah, but this is my job. This is how I pay the bills. It's how I support my family. I take it very seriously as a job." But then to your second point, I was also somebody that built a network of friends and colleagues and my agent and people that I trusted so that when I finished a draft of something, there was always people I could give it to before I turned it in to the studio or the production company, whoever, and just give me some feedback. What do you think? And then one of the beautiful things about my teaching career is that I've actually now developed a network of former students who are working in the business who I'm still in touch with. And I just finished a script today that I said to my wife I'm going to send to Connor to get his opinion before I turn it in to the guy I'm writing it for. And Connor was a student who graduated from UCR in 2021, but he's a really, really talented writer who's now working for a writer, director, producer, and I trust his opinion. So, yes, you need those people in your life.
That's
Okay.
awesome. Thank you.
So you've mentioned that you wrote for many studios and producers and stuff like that. Is there a system or the way that you filter through notes? As writers, we sometimes tend to guard our material
Yeah.
very carefully and don't want to listen to anyone. What to you is the advice you would give to writers when faced with criticism?
Pick your battles. So, as you mentioned, I ended up doing 11 movies for the Disney Channel. And the biggest challenge there was one executive who was the head of movies and another executive who was the head of the studio. They both had authority to give me notes on every project. They hated each other. They saw the world really differently. And so I would get completely conflicting notes that one would say to do one thing and the other would say to do the opposite. And that happened all the time. And kind of how I navigated my way through that situation was half the notes you get, I would always call them lateral notes, which would mean it's not going to make it better or worse. It's just their opinion. So, I would have, they're driving a Volkswagen and they would go, "Can you make it a Chevy?" And it's like, "Sure." Whatever. Those kinds of things I always said yes to. And then when I would get a note that affected the kind of integrity of the storytelling, I would say, "I could do that, but you have to be aware that's going to affect A, B, C, D down the road. That was specifically planted because it's building toward this." And most of the time, if you are arguing from a place of story and passion as opposed to ego, I could usually win because before that, I gave them 10 of the notes they asked for. Sure, sure, I can do that. Yeah, I'll make that work. Yeah, I'll figure it out. But then when it really mattered, like I said, I was always fighting from a place that was about making the movie better, not about I need to win. It's my ego. And so I think it's learning how to do those two things of paying attention to what the note is. Sometimes, even if you don't agree with their solution, there's something there that is bothering, it is rubbing, and then you go back and go, hey, can we talk about this? I don't entirely agree with your solution, but what exactly is it that isn't working for you? And maybe together we can figure out something that works for both of us. So I think it's, being willing to compromise, being willing to understand what's beneath the note, and picking your battles and fighting when it really matters and when it's going to, like I said, affect the integrity of the story you're trying to tell.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
been definitely a good one.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really easy, especially like probably starting out, when we put so much care into our writing and we care so much about our job that like sometimes it's easy to get lost in kind of like the thought of like, oh, but like I worked so hard on this
Yeah.
when, it's not always about that.
Yeah. And so it really
Um,
is learning how to balance your ego that way of, okay, yes, but, is there
mhm.
something behind this note that can actually make the story better?
Um, so kind of speaking about working in the industry and kind of a bit of a workflow, um, and kind of looking back at your, decades long career, how different did the industry look to you at the start of your career, and how has it changed for screenwriters since then, in your view?
The technology has changed tremendously. And with that, there's pros and cons. So, one of the things I always said as a professor, what you guys have the ability to do that I didn't is you can go make a feature film on your smartphone, and those things are getting distributed nationally. There's been at least now three feature films that premiered at festivals that got picked up that had national releases. Florida Project is one that comes to mind that were shot entirely on a smartphone. So when I was starting out, everything was on film. Everything required movie cameras and a movie lab and editing bays. And, you had to have access to all these things that were impediments to being able to just go do your own thing. And because you guys can go do it, you should be doing it. And, one of the things I always said, and probably said it in our class all was, at some point I was going to go change my name to Professor Nike because kids would come in and say, I want to do this, I want to do that. And I would go, just do it. You know, you can do it. I couldn't. So there's that part of it. But then what's gone hand in hand with that is there's been a very big consolidation of the industry. And one of the things that why that has happened the way it's happened is when I was starting out, movie studios were independently owned and they were to make movies. And now every studio is owned by a corporation. The corporation has shareholders and stockholders and people to report to, and it's so
Mhm.
much more about the bottom line. And so the purity of like the whole independent film scene in the 70s when incredible movies were being made, things like Easy Rider and Chinatown and movies like that, I don't know that they could get made today because it's all about the reason all the franchises and the Marvel movies and the IPs, wanting to IP from intellectual property, all of that is because everybody wants the blockbuster. And so the big consolidation of the industry versus when I started out is that whole middle range, what was then 10 to $15 million movies that were a little bit more experimental, a little bit more character driven, a little bit more original. Those are really, really hard to get made right now. And the ones that are getting made the way I said. Somebody's just going, I'm just going to do it. And then I'll premiere at festivals. I'll try to get distribution. I'll try to get picked up. I'll try to end up on a streaming platform, but the studio system no longer supports those movies the way they did when I was starting out.
Mhm. Interesting. Yeah, I do think that there is a big consolidation of the studio and everything. It is very it's at times it seems like grim, the future, but
Yeah.
I gotta remind myself that there's some amazing screen written movies that are low budget. Me and Riley went to go see The Roses, and I think it was such a good mid-budget movie
Mhm.
with a great comedy premise.
Yeah.
So there's still movies being made that are really good. I wanted to ask about your um I don't know if it's correct or not from what I read, but
Yeah.
you worked in the 1995 adaptation of Freaky Friday. Yes,
Right.
which, if I'm not mistaken, it was the first remake from the original, or is that
You are correct.
how how was that? And did you think that this story would be so universally loved they got made two more times and a sequel now?
No. So, again, I've said this many, many times, but I was a real Disney kid and kind of like a giant geek in terms of that whole world of the original Swiss Family Robinson, the original Parent Trap, not the Lindsay Lohan version, Absent-Minded Professor, Freaky Friday. All of those were the movies that I grew up on. And one of the incredible things in terms of opportunities and exposure was Disney did not have tours the way Universal does. But somehow my family made a trip out to, I grew up in Rochester, New York on the East Coast, and my family made a trip out to visit friends of my dad when I was 12. And some friend of my father's got us hooked up with a tour of the Disney backlot, and they had just finished shooting Mary Poppins. And so all of the sets and the Hyde Park set where Dick Van Dyke danced with the penguins, all of that was still existing on the back lot of Disney, and we got to tour it. And I was walking around, and then we came around a corner, and there was the house from Pollyanna, which was a Haley Mills movie I loved. And then there was this house from The Shaggy Dog, which was another movie I loved. And I was seeing all these sets from the movies that I grew up on, and I was like, holy cow, this is where I belong. This is where I'm supposed to be. And I was 12 years old, went back east, graduated college, and moved to California. It was just like, that's it. That's right. So that day was the day that was like, I always kind of thought this is what I might want to eventually do. But then walking around the Disney lot, it was like, no, 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 I'm going to be back. And the first time I got to go there as a writer, being, interviewed for a job, and it was like, yeah, I'm back. Here I am, And I don't know if either of you have ever had the chance to go to the Disney lot, but it's like, the you get it sent to an office and they'll say it's at the corner of Dopey Drive and Goofy Avenue. And it's literally that's what the street signs are. And the main executive building, the pillars are held up by the seven dwarfs, these big giant, versions of them holding up the building. And it's just fabulous. And so for a Disney kid to be on the Disney lot as a writer that was starting a project, that was cool. So getting the Freaky Friday job was one of my favorite things that I got to do. And that was the one that had Gabby Hoffman and Shelley Long played the two parts, and they were great. And I'm very proud of the movie.
That's amazing. As you can tell our movie nerd coming out when you said Mary Poppins rap production, because
Yeah.
Yeah,
I love that movie.
I
I
adore
work
that movie.
yeah, I've been working as a substitute teacher. The teacher let me put on left that Mary Poppins to play for the children. The kids still love that movie. It's
Nice.
amazing.
Mhm.
Nice.
Yeah, when I was in high school, actually, I was in my high school, we did like the stage musical version of Mary Poppins. And it's
Cool.
to this day my favorite one I was ever in.
Nice.
And like the movie the is incredible. Oh wow. The side parts that wow, sorry, yeah, no, I'm geeking out. I'm
It
geeking
was
out.
really cool.
Um so uh I guess like kind of in the spirit of like of loving film and all that, are you able to kind of pinpoint what it is about the medium of like film and screenwriting that kind of like just keeps calling you back, that keeps, kind of relighting that fire in you?
Yeah, there's a really interesting aspect of the industry that you guys should definitely be aware of, which is the way the business is constructed. When you are in the middle of it, you are never a success. And what I mean by that is it's so about the next job and what are you doing next and are you going to get hired again? Uh, when I was about to retire from UCR, they had asked if I would. This actually made me laugh. They said, "Would you be interested in us having housing your papers?" And it was like, what? And they and I said, isn't that like what presidents and stuff do? And they said, well, you must have copies of early scripts and memos and all kinds of stuff you've accumulated during your career. We would be interested in having them here in the library. We can digitize everything, and then, future students that might want to study your career or learn different aspects would have access to all these papers? Like, yeah, sure. And the reason I bring that up is in doing that, I was going through bookshelves in my office here at home, where I'm sitting right now, and pulling scripts off the shelf and looking at the cover page and going, man, I don't even remember writing this. What was this? And I would read like 15 pages and like, oh, that was that pilot I wrote for Universal in 2001 that never got made. Or, this was the script that I wrote for this studio that I did two drafts of, and then they decided not to make it. And that was in 1996, so there was this incredible volume of work, but when you're in the middle of it, you tell people, I just got hired, Spielberg just hired me to write this other thing, or he optioned a script of mine, and then they decide they're not making it for whatever reason, or it goes into turnaround and another studio picks it up. And so in the middle of it, all you're thinking about is the next job. Am I going to work again? What's going to happen? And I never had any kind of, this is going to sound like, come on, dude, but it's absolutely true that I never had any sense of the impact my work had on your generation and beyond until when I had my novel Raft was coming out in 2023. And the year before that, the publisher said, it's a family comedy novel. And the publisher said, we really feel like the audience for this book are the kids who grew up on your movies that are now young adults themselves and starting their families and doing all of that, but you have to have a way to reach them. Are you on social media? And I said, no, and I never will be. Leave me alone. That ain't happening. It's an evil world and I don't want to go there.
Hmm.
And then they came back a couple different times. And finally, one of them said, don't you have former students who are fully enmeshed in this world? Maybe one of them would want to run it for you. And I ended up working with a grad student of ours who I hired him in 2020. He's still working for me. And between Instagram and TikTok, we now have 116,000 followers. Um, but again, there's a reason for all of this. But when that started, I had only heard about, how negative the internet can be. And we now have like 1.1 million likes on TikTok or whatever. But the stream of comments of like, dude, you wrote my childhood. Oh my God, this movie. Oh, I remember the first time I saw it, the impact you had. And, with True Confessions that you mentioned, there'll be a stream of, I have an autistic brother, and this was the first time I ever saw a character like him on TV, and it was so meaningful to my family. Or, what this movie meant, and Land Before Time taught me about loss, and I had recently lost my mother when I saw it for the first time, and whatever all those things are. But realizing the impact we can have, and realizing the emotional connection that people have to the films, particularly stuff they grew up on, is really overwhelming, but it's so touching. And that's part of, one of the things that was a tenet of mine in my writing, especially when my career took a turn to family films, was I had this edict that I will never write a stupid dad in my scripts. And stop smiling because you heard me say this in class. And it was part of the whole thing that, I was taking my kids to see these things, and the trope was dad's alone with the kids for 5 minutes and all hell breaks loose. He's so incompetent. The washing machine goes crazy and the top's off the blender and there's food on the ceiling and the baby's in the oven. And, dads are idiots was basically what most movies were about. And I said, guess what? I have two children. My wife goes away for a whole 3-day weekend and she comes home and the kids are still alive. So I will never write a stupid dad in one of my scripts. And there was a couple times at Disney Channel where I would get in fights with them where they would say, well, what about if dad falls down the flight of stairs? And, I go, no, if that's what you want, put it in somebody else's script. It's not going to be in something I write. The message I'm putting out to the world is dads are competent people too. They can raise their children and not kill them, So that was another aspect of taking control and taking power of what I was putting out there, because I was realizing little by little the impact these things were having on the kids that were watching them. And you guys know as kids you sometimes watch the same movie 50 times and
Hmm.
you're learning about relationships, you're modeling behavior, you're learning how social interactions work, how families work. And it was really, really important to me that what I was putting out there was positive.
That's beautiful. Yeah. With that impact, I want to share that I grew up in Mexico, and the movie that introduced me to your work was Land Before Time, as many other things. And I remember people would talk about Land Before Time stuff like that here. I was like, I don't know what movie that is.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's because in Mexico they translated the name to Pie Pequeño or Little Feet, which is the character's name.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my goodness, now I know that movie. The reason I share this is because I was recently listening to some of another podcast I really like with some really critical acclaimed critics, and they were saying that Land Before Time is one of the best children's and animated movies to say. So the impact that you had, not just in the United States, but globally, is a very one and a very impressive one, sir.
Cool. Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I like for me too, it was a moment of like, you mean that Land Before, like with Littlefoot, and like because like as a kid, yeah, it was one of those movies for me too. Like it was like I loved that movie. I loved like it was like that one and like The Lion King were like some of my favorite, animated movies as a kid. And I was making friends like at UCR, and I'd like one of my favorite like fun facts to like big up UCR is like you're the guy that wrote Land Before Time teaches here, right? And people would be, and like engineering students or like biology students would be like, so what? Like like that like because yeah, the impact that like even people who like don't for lack of a better term like don't care about like filmmaking or writing or any of that like the connection that you build with a film is something wholly unique in my opinion. And yeah,
Very
And
I don't
good.
with
know,
that, I
it's
want to talk a little bit about how you came to be attached to that project. And I believe it's also a project under Steven Spielberg, and you had to have meetings with one of cinema's most important characters. How do you keep composure when meeting such impactful people?
Very good question. Well, the relationship started because his first toe in the water in television was the anthology series Amazing Stories. And the executive, and this is another really, really important bit of advice for your careers is the reason I got to Spielberg was I first got to the producers of Amazing Stories. And the reason I got to them was I had taken time off to write a very personal multi-generational family comedy because one of the things I learned really, really early in my career is writers get typecast as quickly as actors do. And so the first couple of things that I wrote that got produced were like teen coming of age and wacky teen comedy kind of things. And I realized I'm more than that. I'm more mature than that. I want to write something that shows the adult side of me more. And so, like I said, I wrote this very personal family comedy script called Kinfolk, and it was about four generations of a family coming together for the grandparents' 60th wedding anniversary celebration. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Blacklist. But that's a thing that Franklin Leonard does about the best unproduced scripts in Hollywood. At the time, the equivalent of that was American Film Magazine would do the same thing. Every year they would put out the top 10 best unproduced scripts in Hollywood. And the way they would compile that list is they would interview studio executives, producers, agents, managers, development people, and say, what's your favorite script that you read this year that hasn't been made yet? And my script Kinfolk ended up on that list. And because of that list, I got all kinds of attention in meetings and people, wanting to know who I was and all the rest of it. And among the people that read that script were the producers of Amazing Stories. And they said, we're just starting to work on this show. It's Steven Spielberg's first foot in the door in television. Will you come meet with us? And what Amazing Stories was basically was Steven would always get an idea. He'd jot it down on a piece of paper. He'd throw it in a file. And he said he was looking through that file one night and he realized a lot of the ideas were more like short stories than feature films. So he went to NBC and he pitched the anthology. What if some weeks it's 1 hour show, 1 hour story? What if it's some weeks it's 2 half hours together? And basically each one was a standalone little movie, but not enough to support a feature. That's what Amazing Stories was. Met with the producers. They gave me one of the scraps of paper with an idea of Stevens. I said, go read it. Tell us how you would adapt it. I came back into the meeting and I said, I know he's the genius and everything, but does anybody know there's no ending to this story? And the two producers went, "Oh my God, we didn't think so either, but we didn't want to tell him." Do you have an idea like how you might wrap it up. And so I pitched something to them that they liked. I don't remember, Saul, if you were ever in my office at UCR, but there was a letter framed on the wall from Steven Spielberg that said, "Dear Mr. Krieger, you took my little story and made it into something really special. I can't wait to find a great director for this. Thank you very much, Steven Spielberg." So that letter was framed on the wall in my UCR office. Out of that, he ended up hiring me for 4 episodes of that show and making me one of the story editors in season 2. We were in the middle of season 2 of Amazing Stories, and his head of development came to me and she said, "Stephen and George Lucas have an idea for an animated dinosaur movie they want to do. Stephen and I were talking the other day, and we feel like you've become an even better writer since you've become a dad." At that point, my son was like 18 months old. Would you want to meet with us about writing this movie? And the thing I said in class, and the thing I will say again today, is when somebody says Steven Spielberg and George Lucas want you to write a movie for them, you say yes. You don't say, "What's it about?" You don't say, "How much am I getting paid?" You don't say, "How long do I have to write it?" You say yes first, and then you work out all the rest of it. And there you are. So that was how I came to Amazing Stories. In that, to Land Before Time. In that first meeting, they said, "We already got one draft of the script from other writers that Steven doesn't like." And I said, "Can you do me a favor? I don't want to see it if it's a script you're not happy with. Tell me what you do want, what you do like, what part of the original pitch from Stephen and George you want preserved. And I would like to start from scratch because I don't want stuff in my head from a draft you're not happy with." And I said, "Cool." So basically, what I inherited and recently found when I was going through, all the papers for the library was a bunch of scraps of paper from Stephen and George with just bullet point ideas like Mom walks past a burning volcano, dinosaurs meet T-Rex, just all this. And they were like, "Make a story." So at the time, my office had a big cork wall at the back of the office, and I just took all the pieces and put them up and started rearranging and taking stuff. And the animators had already done preliminary drawings of the characters, so I had all those pinned up on the wall and just went back and pitched them something. And then the other things that I found that I didn't even have any idea I still had, but when I was going through the papers, I found a series of memos from Stephen that were official on Amblin stationery saying, "To Stu Krieger from Steven Spielberg, notes on draft 1." And I think it was like the third draft where it said, "I'm finally starting to see the movie. Great job, Stu. I'm really excited. Let's keep going." And then a bunch of notes from him. And so it was really fun to find those. And they're now in the UCR archives. So that's how I got there.
So, um, wow, that sounds incredible. The I guess kind of related to this too, whether it was during that or at any other point in your career, we kind of touched on it earlier when you were talking about picking your battles, but have you ever dealt with your work getting cut or edited to a point where you feel like it was no longer true to how you originally wrote it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm very, very lucky because most of the time that was not true.
Mhm.
And ultimately, between film and television, I had more than 30 produced credits of, films and TV shows that got made that I wrote that I have on-screen credit for. Um, of those, I would really honestly say 27 or 28 of them came out really damn close to what was on the page. I had good relationships with directors. That's another thing of, often writers, once the director comes on board, you never hear from them, the writers again. I was really careful about cultivating relationships with most of the directors on my project. I was not a pain in the ass to have around, so I got to stay pretty involved. I got to see dailies when things were being shot. They would send me the footage to look at, and if you got any thoughts, if you have any comments, let us know. Probably the biggest one, and it was very, very early in my career, but Alan Carr was the producer who also did the John Travolta, Olivia Newton-John Grease film. And the film I worked with him on was called Where the Boys Are 84, which was a remake of a movie from the 60s. And Alan was a very flamboyant, very opinionated, very larger than life personality. And I had spent all 4 spring breaks during my time in college on the East Coast in Florida. And I knew that scene really well. I knew the insanity that went on. That was the script that I wrote. It is not the movie that got made. And the movie that got made is pretty terrible. And then, because show business is hilarious, I don't know if you know who Leonard Maltin is, but he was a very prominent critic in the early 2000s. He was on TV for a while. His column was in a bunch of newspapers. He's written a bunch of books on film criticism. And when Where the Boys Are 84 came out, Leonard Maltin said, "This film has all the charm of an oil slick." So now that was Where the Boys Are 1984. So cut to 2000, what would it have been? Sometime in the early 2000s. And I also wrote not the sequel, but I mean, not the remake, but the sequel to Parent Trap, which, as I mentioned, was one of my favorite movies growing up with Haley Mills. And I got to write the sequel that she was going to be starring in as an adult. And it was one of the most amazing kaboom of my life and career because I had such a crush on her when I was a little kid in Rochester. And suddenly I'm going to the set to hang out with Haley Mills. That was in 1996 or no 1986, and we are still friends to this day. When we are in England or she's in LA, we see each other, and all that's a whole other brain kaboom. But Turner Classic Movies was honoring her in Hollywood, and she invited us to come for the screening. Long story short, somehow we ended up in a van with my wife, Haley Mills, and Leonard Maltin, the critic who said your film has
Wow.
the charm of an oil slick. And my wife, being a wise guy, is leaning into me going, "Tell him you wrote Where the Boys Are. Tell him what he called your movie." And I go, "I'm not going to say it. Shush, be quiet." But that was a full circle moment.
Wow.
Mhm.
But I would say that was the one of all the things that I did that had very little resemblance to what the script I turned in to what ended up on screen. And then my name was still on it. And it was a movie
Mhm.
that, opened nationwide in 2,000 theaters, whatever. And I was getting all these just horrible reviews. And you have to just let your ego go because I said, I can't get in the car and drive to every critic in the country going, "Wait, you should read the original script. The original script's funny." you know.
Yeah.
But I didn't. So,
Mhm.
you lick your wounds and move on and do the next one.
Yeah. Wow. That is an amazing like full circle movement.
Yep.
Um,
Mhm.
with that touching about directors and working so closely with it, do you find it it seems now that the industry wants more writer and director combos. They are taking less gambles on just single screenwriters.
Yeah.
Do you think it's a a good director or a good writer should know and be able to pull off both? Or is it two different disciplines that's kind of erroneous to expect writers and directors to be good at both?
Yeah, it's really knowing your own skill set. I am not a director. I never was. I
Mhm.
never will be. It's not how my brain works. It's not how my eye works. I don't have the patience. Whenever I was on a set of one of my movies and they would shoot the master shot, I would go, "I'm good." And then they're like, "Wait, we got to do the two shot and the close up and the over the shoulder and the this." And it's like, "Oh man, no." I do not have the patience. I don't have the interest. And then conversely, my son, who is a writer, director, actor now, he was 6 years old and he was making flip motion whiteboard movies with a director's eye. He knew perspective. He understood if you put the camera up here with his video camera and do this, you're going to get that effect. His brain does work that way. And I've been on sets when he's directing and he will do a dolly shot and have it push in, push in, push in, and turn to his cinematographer and go, "Okay, do exactly that, but at half speed." And I will say, like, "Why?" And he goes, "Because trust me, when in the shot, I need it to be this, not that." And so he can see the whole movie cut in his head. He can do all that. I do not have that skill. So I was very fortunate that, several of my writer director friends would say, eventually you're going to get frustrated enough, you'll direct. You'll see too many of your things mangled and you're going to want that control. And I go, "Nah, I'd rather be home at 5 o'clock having dinner with my family than on a set till midnight. It's just not my personality." So I think, there are many, many, many incredibly talented writer directors. There are others like me who our skill set is when I'm writing, I see it. It's all very visual. It's very in motion. I do not have the brain to then translate. Where does the camera have to be? How does the camera have to move? What, I, and I feel very blessed that other people know how to do it, love doing it. And my thing was always invite me to the premiere. I'm good. God
Mhm.
bless you. Here you go. Call me when it's done.
Mhm.
Riley, go.
Um, so do you we talked we've talked a lot about about your different successes in your career, especially like as things really started to take off. But what did it kind of look like at the very beginning? And was there anything you had to do outside of your comfort zone to break into the industry, even if it necessarily didn't involve writing?
Yeah. First of all, you have to be willing to do anything. You have to be willing to say yes to anything. I was really, really fortunate, and in some ways, there was a false start in the sense that, like I said, I came out from Rochester, New York with no connection to the industry whatsoever. The first job I got was at a newspaper that no longer exists, but it was the Los Angeles Herald Examiner. I was hired as a copy boy, which is equivalent to a PA on a movie set, just running around doing errands for everybody at the paper. But any minute that I wasn't on a specific assignment, I was hanging around the entertainment department and saying, I want to be a screenwriter. What do I need to know? Who should I meet? Where should I be? And they were really good at giving advice. I realized I needed an agent. I met with the Writers Guild that had a published list of agents that would be willing to read from unproduced writers. I started sending scripts out with query letters. Here's who I am. Here's what I do. I was working it all the time. And so I think that's the other thing. I would get very frustrated with students that would come into my office hours and go, Hey, I want to be a writer. Do you have any advice? And I would say, What are you writing right now? Well, I got some ideas. Then you're not a writer. Writers write. So that was one thing early on. I was always writing. I was always creating new material. I was always building the portfolio. I was researching the industry. After a while at the newspaper, they started letting me do celebrity interviews, and I would go, meeting with these celebrities that were on television. At the beginning, I would go, Hey, if you have 10 minutes at the end of our interview, can I pick your brain about some things I'm trying to do? And almost everybody was fantastic with that and just cumulatively getting advice, sending scripts out. And then I got an agent through one those submissions that said, I like your writing. Can we meet? I met with him. He was interested in representing me. And I think I was with him about 6 or 7 months, and he introduced me to a producer who was doing a low budget teen comedy thing and hired me to write that. So I was very, very unique and fortunate that my first feature film got made when I was 24 years old. But that was, like I said, an incredibly low budget thing. That producer hired me to write another movie for him. Then I, I had like every year something moved the dime a little bit farther forward. But at the same time, I was a production assistant on 3 weeks of the original Halloween because a couple of my friends were working on it. And I just said, the one movie got made, but it didn't pay me enough to support myself for the rest of my life by any means. I need a
Mhm.
job. And they said, well, one of the PAs, I forget if they quit or had another job come up or something, we need somebody just for a couple of weeks. And I was like, good, I'll do it. And I worked on Halloween for a couple of weeks. And Saul, you remember Dean Cundy, the cinematographer who did Jurassic Park and Back to the Future, all the rest of it. I met Dean on all those low budget movies. I just had lunch with him last week because a filmmaker is making a documentary about his life and career. And he called and said, Would you come meet with the guy? He wants to question you about the early days and all of that. But it was building those relationships, maintaining those relationships so that when my friends were working on things, even if, like you said, it wasn't a writing gig, but it was like, I'm going to be working on a movie and getting a paycheck for 3 weeks, I'll do it.
Yeah, that's amazing, and it's great that you still have that connection from just working. I know me and Riley and my other two friends were constantly in sets, meeting people who we don't know we're gonna see again or stuff like that. But it's all about that building and knowing people. Um, we are running out of time, so I just gonna do what we like to do at the end, kind of to ease the tensions. We talked a lot about your career. Now we're just gonna do some rapid fire questions. All right,
Right.
just the first movies that come up to your mind. All right. Um, First movie you ever saw at the movie theaters, or that you can remember at the movie theaters.
Yeah, it was a Disney feature film called The Great Locomotive Chase, and I just remember big ass trains coming at me when I think I was like 4 or 5 years old, but that's the first one I remember seeing in the theater.
Okay. Second question is, what is the movie that you walked out of the theater and you were like jealous because it was so good and you wish you were the one to have written that movie?
The original Parent Trap.
Okay, wow.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Mhm.
And lastly, there is a warehouse with all the movies ever made. It caught catches on fire. What movie do you go in there and try to save?
The Graduate.
Oh, great
Great pick.
answer.
Great
Great
pick. Great
answer.
pick.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you so much again, Professor. I think something that you instill in a lot of your students is the importance of being proactive and just being determined into just continuing your goals. There are so many of the faculty and your sir are proof that in this industry, if you keep working at it, cinema will hug you right back one of these days.
I could not agree with you more, and I really appreciate you doing it. So keep up the good work, guys.
Thank
And
you,
thank you so
Great
Professor.
to
much.
see you both.